Lorwyn by Corey G. Herndon and Scott McGow. Book 1 of the Lorwyn cycle. Chapter 1. A small party of elves reached the road marker at the edge of the Gilt-leaf Wood an hour after sundown. As a signpost, the carved and sculpted trunk of an ancient rust-coloured oak stood in stark contrast to the lush and varied trees that made up the rest of the forest. The marker's carefully preserved bark was cut with an elegant overlapping seal, and symbols of every noble elf who had passed this way. Many of the seals still glowed with residual magic. There had been much traffic through there recently, due in large part to the guests travelling to the upcoming wedding festivities. Marilyn eyed the glowing markers and fought back a sense of urgency that was not hers to voice. The wedding train should have arrived much sooner. It would have, if only the bride had not lingered so long over her appearance. Paradala moved among the highest echelons of elf society. However, Marilyn did not, so there was no argument to be made. Impatience from a subordinate like Marilyn, no matter how justified, would earn only a rebuke, assuming the misdeed was even acknowledged. Besides, a bride running late was a far cry from a catastrophe. Since Paradala had not yet met her intended husband in person, it was understandable that she took such drastic measures with her appearance to ensure a perfect first impression. By definition, Paradala was perfect, an acknowledged member of one of the most revered elf castes, elite and exalted even among the nobility. Her face and body exquisite examples of delicate symmetry. Her eyes were wide and dark, her elegant features sharp. Her hair was long and lush, and the top of her forehead was crowned with two short, gracefully curving horns. Yet as strikingly beautiful as she was without effort, it still took time and skillful effort to make her perfectly beautiful, to have her outward form match the sound of her flawless voice. Elf castes were ancient, immutable things that superseded tribal boundaries, a universal hierarchy of merit that separated the elves according to their inner worth and their outer value. Perfect elves occupied the pinnacle of influence. Marilyn was one of the next highest caste, the exquisites, who stood over the immaculates, who in turn commanded the mere faultless. Faultless was the lowest status an elf could have and still be an elf. To sink any lower was to lose nature's blessing entirely. Such wretches had no status and deserved no name. Tribes, on the other hand, were broken up along geographical and familial lines. No two tribes were equal in strength or number, but the elves of Lorwyn maintained relative peace through arranged marriages and rough diplomacy. The greatest of the tribes was the Gilt-leaf, guardians of the great forest whose name they shared and the masters of the lower species that infested so much of the world. There were none more perfect than the perfects of Liz Alana, the Gilt-leaf's tribe's shining capital. And soon, Paradala of the Morn Song would join their number. Paradala's voice was acknowledged as the most beautiful in all of Lorwyn, most of all by her intended, an elf named Adrian. As Paradala's sweet singing had earned her a place among the most exalted of elves, so had Adrian's astounding ability to manipulate and sculpt the living trees of the Gilt-leaf, and earned him his place. They were an excellent pair, perfect apart but so complementary to each other that when they were together they were more glorious. Their respective tribes were not so well matched. Many things separated the Mornsong tribe from the larger, more powerful Gilt-leaf. Dialect, territory, wildlife and hunting rituals were just a few differences that occurred to Marilyn, as she rode precisely 10 steps behind and 4 steps to the right of her mistress. She was the only personal servant permitted to ride so close to Paradala. The rest of the party, the various admirers and courtiers and the chorus that followed Paradala everywhere, were obliged to follow her a far more respectful distance. Marilyn's proximity was not simply an honour, but a pragmatic necessity. It was her role to fulfill whatever whims or needs Paradala might require, however seemingly frivolous. Marilyn had to anticipate Paradala's orders before they were even given. As such, she had gained a special insight into the workings of the perfect mind. Without thinking, Marilyn knew that Paradala was fixated on the same thing as everyone else. How Gilt-Leaf standards of beauty differed from those in the Morn Song, if they differed at all. Marilyn did not need telepathy or mind powers to know the thoughts of others. The matter on all of their minds affected them directly and personally, as the members of the perfect circle had to look the part and embody their mistress's glamorous aesthetic. All minds except perhaps those of the chorus. Marilyn tended to overlook the dozen or so elves who marched in formation and wore the distinctive silvery robes of immaculate vocalists. Paradala's chorus continued their low, continuous, ever-changing melody, standing ready at all times to accompany their most splendid and perfect mistress, if she would burst into song. Even while Paradala slept, the chorus continued to sing, rotating in 6-member shifts like guards at a town gate. Despite the chorus's efforts, however, their most splendid and perfect mistress was not in a singing mood. Paradala did not sing without reason, and she had no reason at present. It was a sign how far from glory the Morn Song had fallen, that any elf, let alone a perfect's own entourage, would have to consider whether the Gilt-Leaf would accept their mistress's beauty. None dwelt on the differing standards more than Paradala herself. Marilyn knew as her mistress tended to obsess over appearance precisely because her voice's beauty set such a high standard. If Paradala allowed her vocal talents to completely outstrip her physical beauty, her status as a perfect might be questioned. As a mere exquisite, Marilyn thought this rather foolish, but knew too well that her lot was not to give advice unless it was requested. Paradala's impending nuptials would in all likelihood mean the end of the Morn Song as a distinct elf tribe. The Gilt-Leaf would extend their influence, and in 20 or 30 years, only the eldest of the Lorwyn's short-lived elves would remember the Morn Song tribe. Yet, the Morn Song ways would survive. If Paradala married as well as she planned, the songs themselves would echo across the woodlands for generations. Paradala guided her long-legged servant up the marker tree. She could not pass by without leaving word that the perfect elf had trodden this path. Strict elf laws directed her to leave her seal with the most potent magic she had to offer, and only a solution of pure river water and moonglove could permanently etch the aged bark of the waymarker. "Marilyn," Paradala called from atop her servant. The live, deer-like animal's pale fur glistened in the starlight that streamed past Paradala's elegantly curving horns. "I require fresh moonglove." "Of course, most splendid and perfect Paradala." "Off with you, then," Paradala sniffed. "There have been more than enough delays." As if the delays had been the maid-in-waiting's fault. Fortunately, Marilyn was no novice when it came to finding moonglove in the wild. Every elf, even perfects, carried a small supply of the plant's extract somewhere on their persons for emergencies, and for etching waymarkers. Marilyn had already exhausted her store of moonglove on previous waymarkers. The fact that Paradala had forgotten to bring her own supply was a sign of her anxiety. The outer edge of the Gilt-Leaf wood was likely a place as any to find good moonglove. In fact, it was probably better than most, if you wanted quality. Moonglove could not be cultivated, but the frighteningly poisonous flower could be encouraged to grow, especially in dense occupied stretches of forest. The Gilt-Leaf were masters of such encouragement, and Marilyn didn't have to go far before she spotted the distinctive blue-white bells glowing softly beneath the boughs of a young bloodsap cedar. Moonglove grew on almost any tree, but the bloodsap made the effects of the flowers poison, even more potent. Marilyn was still close enough to the party to call back, "Perfect, a good omen. I've found the most fine and uncommon bloom. I beg a moment to fetch it for you." "I do not require frequent reports," Paradala replied. "I require moonglove and river water, in which I shall dilute the poison in the prescribed manner. Speak to me again when you possess it. Exquisite, and not before." The exquisite in question concealed a sigh. Paradala only called her exquisite when she was displeased. Marilyn nodded as pleasantly as possible, before returning to the flowers and the problem of how best to retrieve the bloom of her choice. The spongy forest floor was a mat of mosses and ground-hugging vines of ivy, carpet oak and intermittent brambles, covering who knew how many rodent holes. Marilyn wondered how the gilt-leaf got about in their famous homeland with these vines growing everywhere. She'd seen their likes back home in arbor morning, but not this thick. Leading the servant to the side of the trunk and leaping from there to the lowest branch was out of the question. The risk of her mount's slender legs being caught up in the rodent holes and brambles was too great. Marilyn paused to stretch her spine and neck, and then vaulted backwards off of her mount. In the process she turned a full somersault and landed on both hoof feet. Carefully navigating the brambles that littered the forest floor, Marilyn made her way to the base of the tree. Moonglove flowers never grew less than 10 feet from the ground, but this specimen was much higher. The exquisite silver dagger glittered in the scattered light of the sunset, and she placed the blade between her teeth and wrapped both arms as far as she could around the young cedar tree. She dug into the bark with surprisingly sharp fingernails, braced a foot against the tree, and shimmied up the rough, cracked bark. Marilyn's fingers had just reached the tangled cluster of fibrous roots that held the moonglove fast to the tree, when she felt a sharp and sudden pain in the back of her hand. She let out a short exclamation and jerked back her outstretched arm. She heard a chattering sound and craned her neck back to see what had bitten her. Some kind of stinging insect by the look and sound of it. She could hear its buzzing wings, but a direct look at the thing was impossible, as it hovered just out of her field of vision, hidden in the shadows. Tentatively, she extended her hand towards the moonglove again. She could still hear the buzzing, but it sounded as if it were coming from many places at once. It was then that Marilyn noticed another change in the sounds of the forest. Before the buzzing of the mysterious insects, something else was different about the aural landscape. The scattered bird song and rodent's chirp hadn't changed in frequency or pitch, so whatever the stinging bugs were, they didn't seem to be disturbing the rest of the local fauna. It took another moment for her to put her finger on it, as she flexed her long, slender ears to pick up on the slightest variation in the background. And suddenly the difference was shockingly obvious. The chorus had stopped singing. This was unheard of. It would fall to Marilyn to discipline the singers, as she did not relish the idea of serving as the conduit for Paradala's most extreme ire. For the chorus to cease, creating the ever-present vocal backdrop, was an unthinkable insult to their most splendid and perfect mistress. The strange silence grew ominous, and Marilyn placed thoughts of punishment aside. The chorus willingly falling silent was unpardonable and unlikely, but the entire elf party doing so was a matter of far more serious concern. Ominous silence or not, it would not do to return without the moonglove that she had been sent to collect when it was inches from her fingertips. Marilyn reached up, stretching as far as she could, and plucked the moonglove from its home with far less delicacy than was normally prescribed. Whatever had stung her before left her alone, though she could feel the breeze in her hair from its tiny wings. It was watching her, and it was close by, hovering just out of sight. Its proximity sent an involuntary shiver down Marilyn's spine, and in need to get both feet back on the ground, overwhelmed by her other senses, the maiden-waiting jammed the flower into her belt and then released the tree trunk, spinning to land on both feet. Marilyn faced the road, gulping breath to replace what the 15-foot drop knocked out of her. But she saw nothing, and nobody from Paradala's entourage. There was nothing where the servants should have been peacefully nipping at the low new growth, and nothing where the chorus should have been arranged to surround Pardala with tonally perfect song. Nothing. No admirers, sycophants, or bodyguards distributed respectfully along the open road. The entire morn song contingent, awaiting Marilyn's return, was gone. Nothing but the marker, the road, and the forest remained, none of which could have been expected to depart in any case. Marilyn moved quickly but carefully back to the road. The sun had begun to set, and the stale breeze raised the dusty haze over the forest floor. Marilyn felt real panic until she finally spotted a host of familiar faces and figures. They were all there, arranged as they had been on the far edge of the road. Pardala sat in glorious repose atop her blessed golden servant. Marilyn smiled briefly, raising a hand to hail her mistress, and received not even a nod in reply. The Mornsong bridal party was as it had been, with one difference. The mounted nobles and marching chorus were upright but motionless. They stood rigid, frozen like topiary hedges cut into the shape of elves on a windless morning. Marilyn stared, unable to formulate an explanation. She heard a crack and a slithering sound, and the road grew brighter as the uncanny glow from the dusty fog increased. Marilyn gasped as the newly illuminated scene presented itself. Thick vines covered in blue flowers wrapped tightly around the elves' throats. The morn song would choke tethered like a pack of cuffhounds before the hunt. Their eyes were open, their mouths gaped, and the vines cinched tighter, doubling and redoubling around the elves' necks. The air above their heads was thick with dark, buzzing shapes that gestured with sharp-tipped limbs and sneered at Marilyn, their eyes glittering in the light of the setting sun. They were dead. All dead. That much was obvious from the frozen fear on their faces and their crushed windpipes beneath their chins. Only Pardala wore an expression of mild surprise rather than shock, as if her sudden and silent death was more inconvenient than painful. She burst into a run the moment her heart resumed beating. "Perfect!" Marilyn called. "Paradala!" She made it several feet before she caught one of her toes on the ropey vine whose other end wrapped around a chorus member's neck and flew towards the writhing tendrils on the ground. She instinctively thrust her arms forward and splayed her fingers to make as little contact with the aggressive plant as possible. Those parts of her that didn't touch it, her palms and knees, tingled and grew numb. Marilyn tried to shout for her perfect mistress once more, but she failed. Her limited contact with the vines appeared to have stolen her voice. This confirmed to her that the vines weren't wild or a natural phenomenon of the gilt-leaf wood, but dark magic that had already had a hold on her. The numbness spread as the vines curled up Marilyn's spine and wrapped around her throat, pulling her to the ground. Other tendrils lashed at her like whips, slicing into the exquisite skin, encircling her wrists and ankles. Strung up like a jester's marionette, almost lost in pain and panic, Marilyn still felt the tiniest ray of hope. Whatever was happening to her, it was not elf magic, not one of the spells that the gilt-leaf used to convert living things into vine-encrusted warriors. She might die, silenced as the rest of her tribe had been, but she would not become the joyless heart of a mindless wooden shell. A cold stupor crept through her body, eclipsing all hopeful thoughts. Already, Marilyn could hardly move her arms and found her legs to not be much better. The vine noose tightened, and her head lolled to one side. Her breathing was ragged and laboured. Swarms of indistinct buzzing figures descended, not close enough for her to see them clearly and understand their words, but close enough for her to hear their eerie whispering voices. A velvet half-darkness enveloped her mind as the vine continued to stretch and coil around itself and its victim. Yet She could still breathe and even move to a certain extent. Perhaps the others were still alive. After a short and painful struggle, Marilyn twisted her upper body until her hand pressed against her belt. She carried a few simple and mostly ceremonial weapons on her person, like any elf of quality, but none of those could help her. Her dagger was far out of reach in the small of her back. With another painful twist, the exquisite managed to pry the moonglove flower loose from her belt. With a grunt, Marilyn shifted her left leg forward and pressed the flower's glistening petals directly into the rough, writhing vines holding her right wrist. She heard something like a hiss of shock as the tendrils released her. Marilyn wasted no time in snatching the moonglove flower with her freed hand before it could drop and pressing it into the vine around her neck. When the vine recoiled and withdrew, the elf used the blue-petaled flower to free up her other hand. She was loose, and in the next instant she dropped hard onto the packed earth of the forest road. The numbing effect of the vine's stupefying magic saved her from pain upon landing, but the impact still knocked the wind out of her. She saw, but did not feel the moonglove flower leave her fingers and flutter down to the dirt. The grasping vines maintained their distance, but Marilyn could barely move. Her eyes were completely free, however, and she saw things in the air. The thing that had stung her, and its friends looping and careening through the dark. She could see nothing else, nor could she hear any fauna in the trees. The vines writhed violently, and the insects' buzzing grew more frenzied. The shadows grew darker. Unable to stand, Marilyn pulled herself into a sitting position. Her chin dropped to her chest, and her eyes found the moonglove flower resting on the bare ground. It was the moonglove poison the vines feared, if plant fibers could be said to feel fear, and Marilyn expected that they could. This conjecture was supported by a new shift in tone of the buzzing insects. It seemed to rise in anticipation, or perhaps anxiety. She let herself fall forwards, landing atop the flower. This crushed the hundreds of tiny crystalline pollen inside it, which contained the most concentrated and deadly form of the moonglove's poison. Though elves were the only known species on Lorwyn largely immune to its effects, the raw moonglove could still burn skin with its acidity. Numb as she was, Marilyn suspected she would hardly notice the inevitable rash that would result from the poison soaking into her clothing. But she was wrong. It was an irritating but hopeful discovery to learn that she did feel the burn of the poison, and her aggravated nerves helped to reactivate the sensation in her limbs. The vines closed in again as Marilyn's body shielded them from the blue flower. Marilyn waited. Then she pushed herself to her knees, allowing the pungent tang of fresh, raw moonglove to waft into the air. The vines withdrew even further, like wolves encircling a campfire but unwilling to venture into the firelight. The stinging things continued their eerie buzzing. Marilyn wished she could see one of them clearly, wished one of them would just come within reach so that she could crush it with her palm. Marilyn's time was running out. Little more could be squeezed from the moonglove's pollen, though its petals were still shiny with a thin film of poison. Once that was gone, there was nothing between her and her tormentors. Marilyn clumsily forced the battered flower back into her belt and struggled to her feet. With hands that felt encased in thick leather mittens, she smeared the moonglove extract over as much of her clothing and skin as she could manage, careful to keep it from her eyes and mouth. All the while, the vines kept their distance, rustling without a breeze, waiting. The rustling grew louder towards the centre of the vine mass that had grown to enshroud the elf party. A familiar elf shape arose from the writhing mass, tendrils shaped into a ghastly parody of Padala's lissome form, billowing like merrow fishing nets in a strong tide. The false perfect was sallow and drawn, her woody skin taut and stretched, her body dry as old kindling and bizarrely lined with the seams of vines of which it had been formed. The copy's empty eye sockets opened sleepily, though thankfully not very much, as they turned towards Marilyn with terrifyingly keen interest. The effigy spoke, with a voice that would never be called the most beautiful in Lorwyn. "Attend me," the parody of her mistress said, and there was wheezing, a harmonic quality to the outer edges of the sound. "I need you." Marilyn had heard enough. This blasphemy brought on a surge of courage that burned away the vine's poison in her veins. It was not her mistress, and its hollow call was a horrid mockery of the most beautiful voice in the world. Without lowering her eyes, Marilyn patted her belt until she felt the mild sting of moonglove flower. She held the blossom before her like a lit taper in a darkened cave, and turned deliberately from the emancipated mockery of the perfect she'd served. As she had hoped, the vines kept their distance, creating a bubble of protection that let Marilyn walk slowly away from the Paradala thing. She could hear running water not far away. Perhaps a quarter-mile distant, and down a steep slope was a river where she'd intended to draw water for the moonglove engraving solution. Clutching the flower, Marilyn picked up her pace. The vines continued to give her a wide berth, but they followed her every move. Whenever a few tendrils got too close, she'd wave the moonglove at them and they'd recoil. She reached the point where the forest floor met the top of a heavily wooded riverbank. The pursuing curtain of vines and insects retreated with something like a snarl. It was enough to give her a clear path to freedom. She willed her still tingling legs into action and managed to lurch down the slope. Marilyn was lucky to have made it to the beginning of the drop before she tripped again, this time in some rodent hole, and tumbled down the incline like a tightly curled hedgehog. That way, at least, she was still making progress. She suffered more cuts and bruises as she rolled towards the rushing water below. It was all she could do to maintain consciousness when the chaotic roll ended against a boulder overhanging the river itself. The river was wide and fast and appeared devoid of murderous plants or stinging insects. Marilyn pushed herself to her feet and leaned against the boulder, looking over the glassy black water, and at the dipping sun mirrored on its surface. The elf glanced back up to the slope to see the writhing vines at last venturing over the edge. She still held the moonglove flower, miraculously intact after her tumble, and her clothing was still soaked with the blue flower's poison. She wondered if it would keep the vines away for long. "Damn it," she cursed under her breath. "Should have learned to swim." She could probably make it to the opposite shore if she could keep her head and remain afloat. She'd seen others do it. It couldn't be that hard. Holding the moonglove in her breast, she dived headfirst into the open space, involuntarily closing her eyes and mouth in anticipation of the impact with the water's surface. She'd deliberated a heartbeat too long. A thick vine lashed out like a whip and wrapped around her ankle, bringing her dive to an abrupt halt a few feet from the fast-running river. Marilyn screamed in frustration as the taut vine held her dangling over the current. She managed to bend at the waist and wave the increasingly pathetic-looking moonglove flower, but the coil held her ankle fast, even as the poison still on her skin caused its colour to shift from dark green to brown. Perhaps, unfortunately for her, this vine had gotten over its aversions to moonglove and decided to sacrifice part of itself to prevent her from escaping. Finally, deliberately, the living rope pulled her even farther out over the river's surface. Marilyn managed to gulp a panicked breath before the vine dipped her head first into the icy current, letting her sink until only the sole of one foot remained dry. She flailed and screamed under the water, foolishly wasting what air she had left. Just as she thought she might black out, the vine pulled her back into the air, and the water cascaded down her entire body. blinding and choking her as it filled her nostrils. She had been washed clean of the moonglove poison. From her upside-down vantage point, Marilyn could see the flower bobbing away on the current. She hadn't even realized she'd let it go. So that was it. No amount of kicking or cursing would make the vine release her. It slowly lifted Marilyn and carried her back towards the riverbank and the rest of the ill-fated bridal party. She couldn't reach the vine, but maybe she could reach the boulder. It was just beneath her. Still hearing the spatters of crimson blood from where her head had slammed into the side, she scratched at it with her fingertips, and the moment she caught the edge of the inch-wide crack in the rock, Marilyn forced her fingers into the crack, ignoring what sounded like snapping tendons in her wrist, and soon found the whole of her body pulled taut by the vine. "Not dead! Not yet!" she coughed. With her free hand, Marilyn reached the silver dagger in the small of her back. It wasn't easy to work the weapon loose, but once she did, it fell easily from her sheath into her palm. She slashed wildly at the ropey vine, missing, striking only air until she felt the blade catch against the tendril that held her prisoner. She sawed furiously, and with a twang and a snap the vine severed, and Marilyn crashed to the top of the boulder. She blinked blood from her eyes. The air was abuzz with wings. Marilyn yelped as one of the blurs stung her on the neck, and she slapped at it. Another sting in the small of her back, and another against the side of her leg brought her to her knees. A wooden rope lashed at her neck and arrested her slow slide off the slick riverbank boulder. 2 more stings, 3, and she could no longer feel the tiny jabs of pain, or much of anything else. Not the wrenching agony of being lifted by the neck and rested against the rough, thick-rooted cedar. Not the scratches, cuts, and slivers. Not the tendrils that wrapped around her arms, legs, neck, and waist. She could hear the questions, though. Those came through loud and clear, as if the speaker stood within Marilyn's skull. Despite herself, Marilyn answered.